After the Macedonian army set out in the spring of 334 BC and marched along the northern coast of the Aegean, Alexander the Great reached Sestus after 20 days. From there he planned the transition to Asia Minor via the Hellespont. Since the Persian fleet had failed to block the strait, Alexander was able to position his fleet, consisting of 160 triremes and numerous cargo ships, there. While the Macedonian general Parmenion brought most of the army to Abydos, Alexander landed with a small force opposite Troy. Symbolically, he threw his lance ashore, spear acquired, and made sacrifices to the heroes of the Trojan War, especially his role model Achilles, by exchanging his shield for the hero's shield in the hero's sanctuary. He ordered the reconstruction of Troy and granted the new citizens autonomy and tax exemption. In keeping with the thinking and self-image of the ancient world, Alexander attached great importance to religious ceremonies and cultic practices. His honoring of the gods of other peoples and the offering of sacrifices to them was unusual for his time. Within this framework, Alexander's explanation for his campaign as retaliation for the destruction of Greek cities, particularly the Acropolis in Athens in 480 BC, can also be interpreted by the Persian king Xerxes I. In fact, political and economic interests also played an important role back then. At Abydos, Alexander united his main forces again and then quickly marched against the already deployed army of the Persian satraps of Asia Minor. In preparation for this encounter, Greek King Darius III made a serious mistake by not appointing a clear commander-in-chief, but instead leaving the procedure to a war council of his satraps. At this council of war, the Greek mercenary leader Memnon of Rhodes had proposed a defensive strategy to lure the Macedonians into the country and then create difficulties with supplies through scorched earth tactics. However, Memnon was unable to assert himself against the satraps because the Persian nobles saw him as a favor from the great king and also did not want to destroy their lands, which would not befit their honor. Therefore, the Persian army marched to meet Alexander and positioned itself on the eastern bank of the Granicus River. The Granicos River, now known as Biga, was about 20 meters wide at the battle site and flows into the Sea of Marmara. In their desire to strike the invaders as soon as they crossed, the Persian cavalry positioned themselves directly on the river, while the Greek mercenaries were positioned backwards on the rising ground. Alexander immediately recognized the unfavorable positioning of the Persians. The cavalry was an offensive weapon and was not suitable for defending foot troops, especially not against the Macedonian phalangites with their excessively long spears. Even the advice of his general Parmenion, who recommended waiting, did not stop him from doing so because he feared that his opponents would realize their mistake. He positioned the light cavalry together with the heavily armed foot troops on the left and right wings of the enemy army, so that the Persian horsemen were divided into the various focal points. Alexander personally attacked the densest concentration of opponents and the military leaders gathered there with his cavalry, the agema of knighthood. His white helmet bush could be seen in the thick of the crowd, and he narrowly escaped death, finally being saved by his companion Clytos. The Macedonians retained the upper hand and broke through the Persian center. The distant Persian infantry, and especially the Greek mercenaries, were condemned to watch the events. Now they were attacked concentrically from all sides, and only a few escaped, while 2,000 were captured. Only the Thebans were released. The battle took place in early May. Alexander also had the fallen enemies buried and personally asked the wounded about their health and the circumstances of their injuries. The captured mercenaries were taken to Macedonia for forced labor in order to deter Greeks from entering Persian service. After the Battle of Issus, they were given amnesty. The sculptor Lysippos created a group of 34 bronze equestrian statues depicting Alexander along with the generals who died in battle. The statues were erected in the city of Dion and later placed in the Porticus of Octavia in Rome. The victory had broken Persia's power in Asia Minor. Although Memnon had escaped with some of the mercenaries and tried to rely on the Persian garrisons in the Ionian cities, he was only able to establish himself again in Halicarnassus, where he received supreme command of the theater of war in Asia Minor from the great king. Alexander avoided penetrating the interior, even though this would have promised rich booty. In order to deny the superior Persian fleet effective operations, he had to occupy the coastal cities. An exception was Sardis, the satrap residence and former capital of Lydia. The conquest in the interior of the country was necessary to secure the flank of his further ventures. The feared resistance did not materialize, and the commander Mithraeus surrendered the city and castle. Alexander took the Persian into his entourage, while the inhabitants of Sardis and Lydia regained their freedom and their old constitution. Alexander directed his main force towards Ionia, where the cities, provided they were not under Persian occupation or oligarchic rule, willingly opened their gates. His route led through major cities such as Ephesus and Miletus, as well as other important cities such as Magnesia, Trallius, Smyrna, Priene and Clazomenae, to the cities in Curia with the capital Halicarnassus, and on to Perge and Aspendos on the south coast, before he left with his army returned inland to Gordion to overwinter there. At the end of 334 BC, the coastal regions of Asia Minor were largely in the hands of the Macedonians. However, Memnon still controlled the fleet and began to cut off Alexander's connection to Macedonia, with the aim of taking the war to Greece. There was still no cause for concern on the Persian side. The following year, 333 BC, would bring a decision. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander the Great launched his famous campaign in Asia. His first significant battle against the Persians took place at Granicus, where he won a decisive victory and gained control of northwestern Asia Minor. After conquering the Greek cities along the Aegean coast of Asia Minor in the summer of the same year, he moved from Miletus via Iassos and Bargilia into the province of Curia with the aim of conquering Halicarnassus, the capital of this region. On his way he met the exiled Princess Ada, who laid claim to rule in Halicarnassus and adopted Alexander to legitimize his claims to Curia. The siege of Halicarnassus presented Alexander with an enormous challenge. The city was heavily fortified and served as a base of operations for the Persian forces under the command of the mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes. Since Alexander had to disband his own fleet due to high costs, he was unable to attack the city from the sea. In addition to the city walls, three other defenses, the Acropolis and the fortresses of Salmaches and Zephyrion, were strategically positioned to protect the city. Halicarnassus was defended by a mix of Persian troops and Greek mercenaries who had previously fled Athens. Alexander set up camp opposite the Mylasa gate at the northeastern end of the city walls. Since his siege engines were slowly transported behind the army, he was unable to launch any direct attacks in the first few days. Instead, he had to fend off occasional failures from the defenders. After a few days, he decided to take the port city of Mendos, located about 20 kilometers west of Halicarnassus. Although Mindos had little strategic value, it offered itself as a potential ally, assuming Alexander could take the city under cover of night. But when his troops reached Mindos, the city gates were locked and the walls were occupied by fighters from Halicarnassus. Since the siege of Mindos took too much time and resources and Alexander needed the men more urgently to conquer Halicarnassus, he broke off the siege and returned to his camp, where the siege engines had now arrived.
Kill them, and I'll buy you as many whores as you can eat! The enemy? Whores and worse, a lot of them. I've been thinking, would you strike a holy man? This is hot work! Bloody old son!
After the ditch in front of the northeastern section of the city wall of Halicarnassus had been filled and leveled, Alexander was finally able to bring in his siege engines. First, he used siege towers with archers to drive the defenders away from the walls. This enabled the use of battering rams, which were used to destroy a long section of the wall after a few days. However, before the Macedonians could enter the city, Memnon and his troops made a night sortie to set fire to the siege engines. After a fierce battle, the defenders were repelled, killing many of them, including a Macedonian defector named Neoptolemus, whose family was implicated in the murder of Philip II. On the Macedonian side, there were 16 dead and 300 injured, as well as losses in towers and shelters. In the days that followed, occasional skirmishes broke out as the defenders closed the breach in the wall with an improvised semicircular wall and tower. One night, 2 drunken peasanters from Perdiccas' battalion led an uncoordinated attack on the new wall, giving Memnon the opportunity to destroy a Macedonian unit. However, Alexander was able to save the situation, but had to admit defeat and ask for the fallen soldiers to be returned for burial. Despite the defensive successes, Memnon recognized that a decisive battle was inevitable. He formed his troops into 3 waves of attack, while the defenders pressed the Macedonians' flank. Led by Ptolemy, the Macedonians managed to push back the defenders, with Ephialtes falling. The defenders closed the gates too early, causing many of them to fall to their deaths in front of the center gate as the bridge over the moat collapsed. Over 1,000 defenders died in the battle, while the Macedonians suffered only 40 casualties. The battle ultimately decided the battle for Halicarnassus in Alexander's favor. Faced with heavy losses, Memnon decided to abandon the city and move the fleet to Kos. The fortifications were supposed to be set on fire, but this triggered unforeseen fires in the city. Orontopates intended to hold the port fortresses of Salmaches and Zephyrion in order to entrench himself there. In the autumn of 334 BC, after a months-long siege, Alexander finally managed to enter Halicarnassus. The arsonists he managed to catch were executed, while the residents were spared. Not planning to stay in the city longer than necessary, Alexander stationed a garrison of 3,000 infantry and 200 cavalry under the command of Ptolemy, possibly identical to Ptolemy, son of Philip, who would act as strategos to ensure the security of the Caria region. Although the 2 port fortresses were still under Persian control and the conquest was not completely complete, Alexander continued his march eastward into Asia Minor. His main goal, the neutralization of the port of Halicarnassus as a base for the Persian fleet, had finally been achieved. The threat from them diminished, especially after the death of Memnon and the resumption of operations by the Macedonian Greek fleet in the Aegean. A year later, in the fall of 333 BC, the last battle for Halicarnassus took place when Ptolemy and the satrap Asandros defeated Orontopates in a decisive battle. 700 Orontopates infantrymen and 50 cavalrymen fell, while another 1,000 fighters were captured. Orontopaites then gave up the harbor fortresses and fled to the court of the Persian king Darius III. Alexander learned of this victory at Soloi in Cilicia, just days before the Battle of Issus. In the previous engagement at the Granicus, 334 BC, the Persian forces led by the satraps of Asia Minor and their mercenaries suffered defeat at the hands of the attacking Macedonians. Alexander's army continued to advance into Persian-controlled territory by passing through the western coastal cities. In order not to hinder the progress of his land march, Alexander disbanded his fleet after taking Miletus, as it would not have been able to hold out against the superior Persian naval forces anyway. His goal was to advance by land to Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire ruled by great King Darius III. Alexander divided his forces into two groups. The first, smaller unit was commanded by Koinos. Koinos staged an illusion of superiority by lighting so many bonfires before the battle that Poros got the impression that Alexander's entire army was still across the river. Meanwhile, Alexander's group was crossing the Hydaspes River, later named after the battle, in extreme conditions. Poros only monitored the side of the river where he expected Alexander to cross his troops, not knowing that Alexander had already passed the river about 27 kilometers above Haranpur. On one side Poros had the river, which he could not cross with his elephants, and on the other side was Alexander's group. Alexander was aware that elephants could also be dangerous to the Indian troops in battle. Alexander dispatched Parmenion, the commander of his infantry and Peloponnesian cavalry. His task was to reach the Syrian border crossings with his 15,000 soldiers to secure them against the Persians before reuniting with Alexander. Alexander himself led his army first to Issus and then continued along the coastal road, expecting to meet the enemy at some point. Darius also decided to face Alexander's approaching army on the plain near Issus, which he considered strategically advantageous. Both commanders tried to lure the enemy onto terrain that was unfavorable for them. Nevertheless, Darius eventually left the favorable Syrian plain with his large army and marched along a road to the east to Issus, not realizing that the two armies were only separated by a mountain range. When Darius heard of the enemy soldiers left behind in Issus and learned that Alexander had taken the coastal road, he followed him with his troops. Alexander, for his part, ordered his units to return to Issus in forced marches after learning that the enemy was behind him. The battlefield was bordered by the mountains on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. These topographical conditions disadvantaged the Persian superiority in troops, which meant that the terrain worked in Alexander's favor. Alexander placed the bulk of his cavalry on the right wing and joined them. In the center was the Macedonian phalanx. On the left wing, facing the sea, cavalry and infantry advanced under Parmenion. The Macedonian foot troops were to tie down the enemy until an opportunity arose to attack the Persian center. Darius positioned his strong cavalry on the right wing, facing the sea, where the flat terrain was ideal for cavalry attacks. The center of the front was occupied by heavily armed Greek mercenaries. On the left, lightly armed Persian infantrymen were traditionally to operate. The king himself waited with his guard behind the center of the front to see how events unfolded. Alexander gave the units the order to attack, and indeed a gap opened up in the Persian front. His bold advance was exemplary for the cavalrymen and led to success. The Persian infantry retreated but defended themselves stubbornly. Alexander fought his way through the enemy to the vicinity of Darius III. The latter recognized the impending danger and fled. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx had to cross the fast-flowing Pineiros River, which created gaps in the ranks. Greek mercenaries fighting on Darius' side took advantage of this and inflicted losses on the attackers. The Persian cavalry on the seaward side also attacked the Greek infantry and the Thessalian horsemen hard. Alexander helped the beleaguered Greeks by using his cavalry in a crescent-shaped maneuver. He then attacked the flanks of the enemy center. The Persians were discouraged by the flight of their commander. Although the situation was by no means hopeless, the Persians, including their allies, retreated, leaving the Macedonians to win. Alexander massacred the retreating enemies. Darius escaped, while Parmenion and his Macedonian army advanced to Damascus after the battle.
Is not an option! Back!
The Battle of Gaugamela, also known as the Battle of Arbela, today Tel Garmel in northern Iraq, was one of the most important battles in world history and was the high point of Alexander's campaign, which aimed to conquer the Achaemenid Empire. It took place on October 1st, 331 BC. During the siege of Tyre, Darius had offered Alexander the Great the cession of all territories west of the Euphrates, 10,000 talents in ransom for his family left behind at Issos, including his mother Sisygambes, and the hand of his daughter Statira, who had also been captured. Alexander rejected this request against the advice of his general Parmenion. The great king then mobilized the troops of his peoples as far as India. Since this was time-consuming, Alexander initially rounded off the securing of the eastern Mediterranean coast by conquering Gaza and occupying Egypt. In late spring 331, he returned to Tyre. He had the city rebuilt, supplemented the army with 15,000 men from Macedonia, set out in July 331 towards the Euphrates, and crossed the river. After an evasive maneuver in front of a blocking troop of the satrap Mazaeos, the army crossed the Tigris further north in September 331 BC and moved towards the newly formed army of Darius. Alexander had 40,000 infantry and 7,000 horsemen. Although the troops were outnumbered, they consisted mainly of battle-experienced soldiers. The short command chains in particular were decisive in the course of the battle. The corps was made up of the Macedonian troops, along with Greek, Thessalian, and Thracian units. The Macedonians' military branches included the Aetiri cavalry, equipped with helmets and armor as well as lances, which were primarily intended for thrusting and less frequently for throwing, the Hypaspists, who were probably equipped in a similar way to the Greek hoplites, but were relatively mobile, and the Pesatiri, comrades in arms on foot, equipped with extremely long spears, sarissa, of around 5.5 meters in length. There were also lightly armed troops consisting of peltasts, slingers, and archers. Alexander's father Philip had built a powerful army from the loose Macedonian tribal contingents, provided the soldiers with land, and settled them in cities. In this way he ensured constant combat readiness, and the troops were trained through constant campaigns. In addition, allies and mercenaries from Greece and the Balkans were integrated into Alexander's army. From his father, he adopted the tactic of using the infantry mainly on the defensive in order to bring about the decision at the right moment through a personally led attack by the heavy cavalry. This risky approach proved successful at Gaugamela, as in the two previous battles against the Persians. After his offer of division to Alexander was rejected in the spring of 332 BC, Darius mobilized all military forces. According to the sources, almost every able-bodied man was recruited from all regions of the kingdom. His army, which was very ethnically mixed, consisted of regular foot soldiers and horsemen from Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and the coasts of the Persian Gulf. Its core was the Kara, the army, which was permanently under arms. The additional Persian foot troops were mainly servants equipped with a piece of land, who had little combat experience but reinforced the core troops through their numbers. The bulk of the army consisted of troops from the eastern parts of the empire. The cavalry force, which consisted of highly trained fighters, appeared superior. In addition to 12,000 heavy Bactrian horsemen, the mounted units came from central and eastern Iranian regions, from Cappadocia, from Anatolian Armenia, and from the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. There were also horse nomads, Sogdians, Scythians, and others. The Indians provided 15 war elephants for the battle. An old weapon of war was also used, the sickle chariot. This was intended to break up the Macedonian phalanx. The area in front of the battlefield was leveled for 200 sickle chariots. The royal guard was around Darius, behind which were mercenary units of Greek hoplites. These are said to have numbered 30,000 men. Darius had previously reconnoitered the battlefield and had it leveled for his cavalry and chariots. For the first time, Darius' troops used snares, colloquially known as wolves, as obstacles on the battlefield. Darius placed most of his cavalry, as well as sickle chariots and war elephants, in the front line. On the right flank, this was Armenian and Cappadocian cavalry, followed in the center by two groups of 50 sickle chariots each, the 15 Indian war elephants and another 100 sickle chariots. The left flank of the front line was made up of the heavy Bactrian and Scythian cavalry. The second line consisted of more cavalry and mainly of archers and infantry, with Darius himself in the center, flanked by the Greek mercenary hoplites. The third line served as a reserve and was made up of infantry troops that were positioned in deep formation behind the center. The troops were positioned in staggered formations over a width of 3 to 4 kilometers. There was no need to fear an encirclement by the numerically inferior Macedonian forces. Due to their smaller numbers, Alexander's troops were essentially positioned in a single line. In the center were the hoplites, arranged in a phalanx, between and in front of which spear throwers, stone throwers, and archers were distributed in smaller groups. The left wing consisted mainly of cavalry and a few infantry units under the command of Parmenion. The right wing was under the command of Alexander and included the Hetiri cavalry as well as the Paeonian cavalry under Arates and other mounted mercenaries under Menidas. Behind the center, Alexander had another phalanx and infantry set up as a reserve. This was to intervene in the event of an encirclement by the numerically superior Persian army. Alexander opened the battle by having the Hetiri cavalry of the right wing expand in a wide envelopment movement against the Persian left wing. As he had hoped, Darius reacted by sending the Scythian and Bactrian cavalry of his left wing into action to intercept. Alexander's mercenary cavalry under Menidas then attempted to break through the gap that had developed between the Persian left wing and the center in a quick attack. After this attack was initially repulsed, Arates took over the advance with the Paeonian cavalry, while Alexander turned in with the Hetiri cavalry. In the heavy fighting that followed, the Persian cavalry on the left wing was wiped out and put to flight. While the fighting on the left Persian and right Macedonian wings was in full swing, Darius ordered the sickle chariots to attack the center of Alexander's troops. The phalanxes had prepared for this attack and opened corridors in front of the attacking chariots, so that they literally ran into nothing. The chariot crews were immediately attacked from all sides and quickly wiped out. The feared Persian sickle chariots were thus completely eliminated and had caused only minor losses to Alexander's troops. The phalanxes then formed up again and marched forward to attack the center of the Persian army. The situation was much more difficult on the Macedonian left wing, which was supposed to hold a defensive position. Darius had ordered his right wing, the Armenian and Cappadocian cavalry under the command of General Mazaeos, to make a direct attack on the left flank of the Macedonians. Even though the troops under Parmenion were able to hold the position as ordered, they found themselves increasingly hard-pressed. At the same time, Darius set his war elephants in motion to finally break the resistance of Parmenion's troops. At this point in the fighting, two events occurred that would determine the further course of the battle. After the collapse of the Persian left wing, the complete destruction of the sickle chariots and the advance of the war elephants on the Macedonian left wing, the Persian center with Darius was completely exposed. Alexander now launched a direct attack on Darius' position with his cavalry. At the same time, the phalanxes in the center also advanced on this position. Darius seemed to have panicked and turned to flee, which subsequently led to the collapse of the Persian center. At the same time, a gap had opened up between the advancing phalanxes in the Macedonian center and the left wing, which was still involved in heavy defensive fighting, and the Persian and Indian cavalry from the second row of the Persian right wing successfully advanced into this gap. After the breakthrough, they split into two detachments, one of which rushed in a straight line towards the Macedonian base camp, which was about 5 kilometers to the rear, while the other began an envelopment movement against Parmenion's troops. Parmenion, who was faced with the complete collapse of his wing, sent a messenger to Alexander asking for immediate help. The news reached Alexander at the moment the Persian center collapsed. He then refrained from pursuing the enemy immediately and turned his Hetirian cavalry to a relief attack for Parmenion's troops. While the messenger was still writing to Alexander, his infantry reserve reacted to the Persian breakthrough. One part streamed towards their own base camp to confront the enemy there and save their own rear from destruction, which they succeeded in doing. Another part rushed to the aid of Parmenion's troops. For unknown reasons, the attack by Mazaeos' troops now collapsed and they turned to retreat. It may be that news of Darius' escape had arrived or that the Macedonian infantry that had arrived had turned the situation around. Part of Mazaeus' troops, including himself, clashed with the cavalry led by Alexander. In the heavy fighting, Mazaeus was wounded and the majority of the troops accompanying him were wiped out. After the entire Persian army was now on the run, Alexander ordered all troops to attack. Parmenion, who had already started pursuing the remnants of Mazaeus' troops with his cavalry, was able to capture the Persian base camp a short time later. Alexander continued to pursue the Persian troops until sunset and let his troops rest until midnight, then resumed the pursuit. He hoped to be able to catch Darius in the city of Arbela, about 120 kilometers away, but the Persian great king had foregone any rest and had already fled. In October 331 BC, the Persian great king Darius suffered a devastating defeat against Alexander in the Battle of Gaugamela, after which his army disbanded and he himself fled to the Persian core provinces in what is now Iran. After a few days' rest in Babylon, the victorious Alexander took up the pursuit in order to confront Darius as quickly as possible in a final battle. After he had taken the royal city of Susa without a fight at the end of autumn 331 BC, he chose Persepolis as his next target, the oldest capital of the Persians, located in the central province of Persis. In the spring of 330 BC, Alexander resumed the pursuit of the fugitive Darius and entered the Median capital of Ecbatana. The Persian king intended to face him again at the Caspian gates near Ragai, but this time he found no support from his followers, who now voluntarily went over to Alexander. As he continued to flee, he was soon murdered by Bessos. The Battle of the Hydaspes took place in May 326 BC between the troops of Alexander the Great and those of the Indian king Poros on the Hydaspes River, near the city of Nicaea on the Hydaspes. It was Alexander's last and most costly battle. The battle was untypical for Alexander. Poros' army used elephants, against which Alexander had already gained experience at the Battle of Gaugamela. These elephants were a psychological weapon of war for Poros that could hardly be overestimated. Poros also knew how to command the elephants in groups, which was an additional advantage for the Indian king, in addition to the area being unfamiliar to the Greek troops. Poros secured the riverside with the elephants, which made it impossible for the Greek cavalry to cross the river. According to the historian Arrian, the horses were afraid of the elephants. Alexander divided his army into two groups. The first, small group was commanded by Koinos. Koinos feigned numerical superiority by lighting so many campfires before the battle that Poros had to assume that Alexander's entire army was still across the river. Alexander's group, however, crossed the river Hydaspes, after which the battle is named, under the most difficult conditions. Poros only guarded the side of the river where he was waiting for Alexander's troops, not knowing that Alexander had already crossed the river about 27 kilometers above Haranpur. Poros had the river on one side, which he could not cross with all his elephants, and Alexander's group on his side. Alexander knew that elephants could also be dangerous for the Indian troops in battle. Part of Alexander's cavalry hid behind the infantry. The rest of the cavalry split into two parts. One was sent with the infantry, the other part swung far to the right of the main army. This meant that two cavalry units were not visible to Poros. The infantry was ordered not to attack, but to wait at a safe distance. The flanks of the infantry were reinforced by units with projectile weapons. Poros assumed that Alexander would try to encircle him with the part of the cavalry that was visible to Poros, which accompanied the infantry, and therefore reinforced his left wing to prevent a breakthrough there. Since Poros saw that the strength of Alexander's cavalry wing was very small, he sent his cavalry there. He thought he could quickly fight the cavalry and bring his cavalry back to protect his main troops with the elephants. All parts of the Indian cavalry were now on the left wing. Alexander's cavalry, which had previously swung far to the right, as well as the cavalry that was hiding behind the infantry, now attacked the left wing from three sides with the remaining cavalry, thereby destroying Poros' cavalry. The infantry then attacked. Alexander's troops were ordered to attack the elephants in particular. The main targets were the elephant drivers, who were hit with targeted spear throws. The plan worked. The elephants panicked without a leader and were driven back into the Indian infantry formation. This turn of events caused the Indian infantry positions to disintegrate, and the battle was won for Alexander. Alexander, who admired Poros' courage, not only left him his territory but also the claim to several other cities. In return, Poros had to recognize Alexander's supremacy. Alexander's favorite horse Bucephalus supposedly died in the nearby Hydaspes River during the battle. Alexander then named a city Alexandria Bucephalus after Bucephalus. Another city called Nicaea on the Hydaspes was founded in memory of the victory on the spot where the battle had taken place. Alexander also had coins minted that portrayed him as the victor. Alexander's last words when asked who he would leave his empire to were said to have been, "To the best."